All right, so in the mid-1900s, the civil rights movement is the modern civil rights movement that we call the civil rights movement kind of begins. We're going to talk about how that develops and the different areas that takes. So we're going to first talk about what the civil rights movement was like before 1954, the key issues in Brown versus Board of Education and its impact. And we're also going to talk about the Montgomery Bus Boycott and how that's kind of the launching pad of the modern civil rights movement. So before 1900, obviously, the civil rights movement is based on slavery and immediate impacts, or the immediate addressing the immediate problems of ending of slavery after the Civil War with the 13th Amendment. So, you know, obviously, had opposition to slavery in colonial days. You had the opposition that the slaves themselves carried out, whether slowing down for work, singing the spirituals that are forms of communication, or running away. Obviously, after the Civil War and the 13th Amendment, when slavery is abolished, it's going to move towards pushing for greater rights and things of that nature for African Americans. And one of the problems that blacks face in this time is the beginning of passage of laws basically institutionalizing slavery, especially in the South, but elsewhere as well. And one part of this is the 1896 Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson, which creates the idea of separate but equal, which becomes the bedrock for segregation for the next 60 years. From 1900 into the 1930s, you had guys like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois discussing the proper role and proper way forward for African Americans. Washington, for instance, believed that segregation was okay, that blacks should continue to focus on vocational education and training and try to slowly build to full participation in American economy and civic culture. Du Bois had a different point of view. He argued that blacks should be granted immediate full rights as citizens, and so this was a point of contention between the two. And Du Bois along with a multiracial group of whites and blacks, founded the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1909. One of the problems is during the 30s, you know, African Americans suffered worse during the Great Depression than whites, and Roosevelt, because he needed support of Southern Democrats for his New Deal programs, was often slow to institute changes to guarantee African American rights. Now, after the Great Depression, A. Philip Randolph rises as one of the most important leaders. And you also have the founding of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, in 1940. But you did have some movement. President Truman in 1947 signed an executive order that desegregated the United States Armed Forces. And you also had the breaking of the color barrier in Major League Baseball by Jackie Robinson. So both are big changes in American society. The NAACP very quickly seizes on the idea of attacking racism in the courts, right? Thurgood Marshall becomes the head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and they start bringing cases before the court attacking the constitutionality of segregation. And little by little, they start winning victories. For instance, Missouri Gaines versus Canada, Registrar University of Missouri, and in 1950, Sweat versus Painter are both decisions that have to do with admissions processes to university, graduate schools, and undergraduate universities. So they start with the colleges first, right? But eventually, they're going to shift their focus to high schools and elementary schools, the public school system. And the case of Linda Brown in Topeka, Kansas becomes kind of the key focus. So what happens is her case gets rolled into a number of other cases from primarily southern states, but of course Kansas as well, and basically argue that segregation itself is unconstitutional, that there's no such thing as separate but equal. Separate is inherently unequal. And the Supreme Court is going to take the case. And you can see on this map here that a number of states still had segregation. You have in the pink, the states of the Old South plus the border states of Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, as well as the District of Columbia had segregation laws. You required segregation. Your green states here were places where segregation was allowed. Purple states right here, they were states where there was no law at all. So it could be allowed. Some places had it, some places didn't. Of course, in the yellow states here, there is no segregation. So Brown versus Board of Education is a 2-year argument, basically where the court considers arguments from both sides, but also research about the effects on African American children. In 1954, Justice Earl Warren, who was appointed by Eisenhower, leads the court into a unanimous decision that separate schools were inherently unequal and therefore guaranteed and violated the 14th Amendment guarantee of equal protection of the law. And this is a huge decision. But very quickly, states began testing the enforcement of this decision. So in Little Rock, for instance, the governor, Orville Faubus of Arkansas, decides that he's not going to allow integration, and it leads to a crisis. So September 1957, 9 black students try to integrate Central High School, and they're harassed by mobs of angry protesters, white protesters. And eventually, Faubus is going to send the National Guard to Little Rock and force the students to turn back and not allow them to go to school. And this goes on for weeks until finally Eisenhower mobilizes the 101st Airborne and sends the 101st Airborne to Arkansas to enforce desegregation. So this reveals how big of a struggle it's going to be to stop segregation, specifically in schools. All right, the following year, in 1955, following year after Brown versus Board of Education, you have the Montgomery Bus Boycott. And this begins because the buses in Montgomery were segregated. Blacks had to sit in the back if there was they had to sit in the back, and if there wasn't room on the bus and a white patron came on, they had to give up their seat to a white patron. Rosa Parks was a seamstress, but also a secretary for the local NAACP, and she was asked to give up her seat in 1955, and she refused. And basically, this results in a boycott. She's arrested, and a boycott of the buses amongst the black citizens of Montgomery begins. This case, the Supreme Court is going to rule that segregation on buses is unconstitutional as well. However, the boycott continues for a full year, and the buses lose a lot of money because most of the white people had vehicles, had cars, and many of the blacks did not. So when the blacks stopped riding the buses, you would have empty buses running all day. So this results in the formation of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which most people will know as the organization run by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And he was elected. He was a young Baptist minister that was preaching at his first church in Montgomery at the time, and he becomes the leader of the group. And he forwards an idea of mass nonviolent action, basically protests, marches, boycotts, things of that nature. And he got a lot of his ideas from Mahatma Gandhi and his actions against the British rule of India. So basically, Parks was arrested, and the NAACP called for a one-day boycott of the city bus system. So the community leaders formed the Montgomery Improvement Association, and Martin Luther King Jr. was its leader. They continued the bus system not for a day, but for an entire year. And after a Supreme Court decision and basically the financial hardship of the owners of the bus system, basically the court or the integration of buses was accomplished. And this is kind of the beginning of the modern civil rights movement. So basically, the Montgomery Bus Boycott and the tactics that the Montgomery Improvement Association and later the SCLC are going to use to protest and to affect change, protest against segregation and affect change in Montgomery are kind of going to become models for the larger movement. We'll see SCLC and Dr. King obviously become huge figures in this movement and really kind of the recognized leaders of the movement. Although there are a lot more that we'll discuss as we go on forward. As a side note, these notes are going to have a lot of videos that go along with them. So what I'll do is I'll post on the website. There'll be a video page where you can go to view these rather than putting them on the screencast where they don't really come out very good. So as you go through, when you see a slide that's got a video pane on it, then we'll need to go view those on your video page, and that'll be part of. You can do that in class as well. So we'll talk about that. Talk about the movement and its progression as we move forward. So look forward to moving on, and we'll see you in class.